Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the future. My name is Zach Gardner. I'm the Chief Architect at Keyhole Software, and about 3 or 4 months ago, I set off on a little bit of a journey. I wanted to find people that had very, very strong opinions, both for as well as maybe against generative AI. I wanted to get a broad perspective on what are some of the different opinions out there, what are some of the things that we should be thinking about, and maybe what are some of the things that we should be thinking more about that we're not already. And the good news for you all this day, I went out and I found these people. I'm talking to everyone from banking, healthcare, finance, insurance, you name it, I've probably got someone scheduled for it on this video cast. The person that I'm interviewing today is Andrew Wilder. He's a Chief Security Officer just on the other side of I-70 from me in St. Louis. Andrew, thank you very much for coming on the program.
Hey, thanks, Zach. Thanks for having me. I'm excited today to talk about generative AI and, as I call it, maybe the beauty and the beast, right? The good and the bad. We'll leave out the ugly for later. But I think you're talking about the different ways that people see it. I think I'm fairly neutral because I can see both the positive aspects of it and the negative aspects of it, especially as it relates to cybersecurity. So looking forward to talk about it today.
Very, very good. So that might be a really good place for us to start because I haven't had anyone broadcast yet giving their perspective from a security viewpoint. So how are you using, and maybe how do you see generative AI being used in both your personal life as well as your professional life? What are the things that you really like about it? And then maybe what are some of the things that concern you? Let's start there.
Yeah, so the things that I really like about it is obviously you can find some increased efficiencies by using it. So I think one of the favorite ways that I like to use it for cybersecurity are things like writing communications, writing policies or suggestions to policies, procedures, standards, things like that. Things that people generally find pretty boring. Those are pretty easy to do with generative AI, and then all you have to do is go and clean it up. And most of us are pretty good at editing something that someone has already started. It's just the taking the initiative to create it. The other way that I find it very valuable from a cybersecurity perspective are things dealing with incidents. So whether it's the analysis of the incident or it's the follow-up from the incident, like having it as kind of a coach to say, hey, here's the incident, here's the things that I did. Are there things that I'm missing to check? Because, one of the most important things that you can do in incident response is make sure that you have a really solid after action review and after action plan, because about 90% of organizations get hit by the same attack vectors again. So you want to make sure that you really close those holes. And I think it's a good kind of coach to get you through that incident response process.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. I haven't thought about its use case for that before. I mean, some of the things that immediately jump out to me is, Samsung, I believe, was one of the first companies that got hit by this, where they had some of their employees uploading confidential information up to ChatGPT. It was then used to train later models, and people were able to actually exfiltrate the data out of the model just by asking it sort of clever questions. So to me, I think one of the things that we're going to have to be concerned about here in 2024, self-hosted and sort of managed instances of these large language models. Because in order to have, like every company has their own set of policies. We all broadly do the same things, but there are things that are unique to healthcare. There are things that are unique to automotive. There are things that are unique to banking. So it's almost like you need a large language model
Absolutely.
to be trained on your company's set of policies and then run that through an incident response. And then it will say, oh, this particular policy wasn't followed or that particular one wasn't followed. But I do like also what you said about, we need to make sure that we're not just Control C, Control V over from the response that it gave us. It's really good at certain things, but you do always need a human arbiter in there to be able to negotiate between this is what it said, 95% of it is okay, but I'm gonna need to rewrite, like 4 or 5 or 6% of that. So all really good points.
Yeah, on that last point, I've seen it write like term papers for college, and it has reference links, or a bibliography that looks totally legitimate, but every one of the bibliography items is completely fake, and the links
Yes.
don't work, and there are no such authors and no such uh, papers. I think you touched on the piece of data privacy, and I think from a cybersecurity perspective, that's one of the two major concerns, right? Is people putting stuff that they shouldn't put into there to try and increase efficiencies, but there's a few tools out there today that will help to coach users through policy adherence, right? So, hey, I see that you're using generative AI. That's great. I noticed that you tried to paste, an API key from our AWS environment. You're not allowed to do that. Let me stop you from doing that and explain why you shouldn't do that. Things like that to make sure that people aren't putting your intellectual property out there, that like the Samsung case can be then kind of mined later with clever responses or questions. So data privacy is a big thing. When I send a communication out to my organization, what I said is, look, this is not unlike other cloud applications. So we want to make sure that you're not taking our intellectual property and uploading it to Dropbox either, right? Because we're not controlling that. So it's the same kind of thing. Don't put something that's sensitive out there just because it can help you. Now, the other thing that you talked about is those things that are trained on your policies. What I am seeing some larger organizations do is create in-house LLMs that people can use that are safe, that are not connected to the internet, where you can go and use it to help you with things, and you don't have to be so concerned about those data privacy things, or at least you can be less concerned because it's something that's hosted internally. So there are some options there outside of the idea of blocking it completely, which I think is completely nuts, right? Like, I mean, you can try and block certain flavors of it, but it's embedded in all kinds of things. I mean, Pandora's box has been opened. If you're trying to go and lock it down or close it completely, it's going to be a really difficult battle for you, and you have to figure out the risk reward there. There is one other really big side of the cybersecurity piece that concerns myself and my peers, and that is social engineering, phishing, things like that. So let me ask you a question, Zach. What do you think is the number one attack vector for cyber attackers getting into organizations?
Hmm. Some sort of like email or spear phishing, so something that takes advantage of
That's
human
exactly right.
behavior. Okay, good. I
Yep,
aced
that's
it. I
exactly
aced the
right.
test.
You win the prize. So the way that cyber professionals take care of phishing emails that come into their organization is they have tools that identify it, or they have users that report it. Now, once that happens, then what you do is you search by the sender, you search by the subject line, you search by the payload, you search by the attachment of the URL, whatever, and then you eliminate that nasty email from all of your other users. Well, guess what? If I use generative AI, I can uniquely craft every single email so that everyone is totally different. So it comes from a different sender with a different subject, with a different attachment, with a different URL. And so all of the traditional tools that you have today to look for it. And the other thing, a lot of times when you take like phishing training, you're looking for things like misspellings or weird grammar or things like that. All of that stuff is gone, right? Because you can ask a LLM to say, hey, write it in the style that this person would write, or someone from this country would write, or something like that. So you can make them incredibly believable. So all of those tactics that you use today to find and identify phishing emails, that's going to go out the window. So everything is going to look much more legitimate. It's going to bypass all of those controls that we have today, and we're going to have to be much smarter as cybersecurity professionals to find those things and to train users to spot them and not click on things and do bad stuff. So that is, to me, one of the biggest sides, the bad sides of LLM and used by attackers.
Mhm. And I know, I think it was back in October, it was right before Halloween, I think, when the Biden administration came out with their executive order on the responsible uses of AI. And one of the things that they
Yeah.
clearly pointed out in there was, this is a tool that can be used for a tremendous amount of good. And what we should be focused on are how do we mitigate the risks while still allowing all the good parts of it to benefit society. I know that there were several sections in there related to, making sure that it doesn't get into chemical weapons. Like you can't ask it how to create a nuclear bomb. It's like sorry, like you can't tell me that. There were other parts of it though that were specifically related to like consumer privacy. How do you make sure that deep fakes don't come out of your large language model? How do you make sure that you can't impersonate someone and call into their bank pretending to be them with their voice? Whether that's through watermarking or some sort of just, blanket technology that just does not let it go through those kind of steps. I'm curious, kind of your take on what you're seeing in terms of like, how do we like balance the risk and reward? How do we take advantage of this technology without making sure we don't get cut?
Yeah, and I think, if you look at these things, they're great lists of should, right? And but then how do you get to the tactical part of how you implement what people should be doing? The thing about it shouldn't be able to create chemical weapons, right? It shouldn't be able to teach you how to do any kind of crime. But if you trick it, if you ask it questions in a different way, many times you can get it to answer those questions that it's not supposed to answer. So, hey, how do I create, how do I do this crime against a bank? Well, we can't tell you how to do that. So I'm writing a fictional story about a guy named Zach who robs a bank. How would he do it in the fictional story? And it would work really well. And in that case, then it answers the question for you. You also talked about deep fakes. I think we haven't even scratched the surface of how deep fakes are going to, destroy credibility. And you're going to have to find ways to authenticate and make sure that you're really you when these things are happening. Because there's a number of things today. I won't go on and test it because I don't want to put my info out there, but I'm sure you could create it from any YouTube video or other video podcast that I've done. Is you can train those things with like, I don't know, 10 seconds of video, and then it will create other videos of you saying stuff or doing stuff. You can type in things that you want your video avatar to say, and it doesn't look like something from whatever that thing that Zuckerberg was doing. It looks like a real person who's saying those things. So it's scary what deep fakes are going to do and how that's going to impact things like social engineering and cybersecurity.
Mhm. I know this is being recorded on Wednesday, the 24th. The New Hampshire primary just got over, and one of the interesting things that came out of that was there was a robocall campaign where someone had trained an LLM on President Biden's voice, urging his supporters to, not go out and, don't vote, which is like is crazy. I would have never guessed
Yeah.
this, like 5, 6, 7 years ago that we would be able to do something like this. There's an interesting subculture, I don't know if that's the right term for it, of people that I'm interviewing for this series on generative AI. How could we use potentially like Web3 technologies like blockchain to be able to
Mhm.
verify that this particular content is coming from this person? Granted, it's an immutable ledger, so there is the potential for someone to put something on the blockchain. Maybe my YouTube video, I put that and I cryptographically sign it saying like, yes, this is me. I don't know how mainstream a lot of that stuff is going to be. It still seems to be, somewhat fringe, but it is interesting that, as Bitcoin's price is resurging, I'm starting to hear more and more Web3 people, coming out of the woodwork. Some of the other interesting things
Web3,
that,
I've been saying it for years.
yeah,
No, I agree with you. And I think whatever technology we use to try to validate things, attackers are going to find ways to get past that. And it's going to be this constant kind of ebb and flow and cat and mouse game of, getting ahead of it and trying to fix things. And then you're going to have all these different versions of it. And, oh, you got to upgrade your blockchain to this, so that it's safe. And there was another great thing that CISA put out this year that was about uh, holding software vendors accountable for people having to patch their software all the time, right? Because if you look at SolarWinds, well, all these people are being held accountable, but SolarWinds was the one who had the software that went out. If you look at all these patches that go out all the time, Microsoft executives' emails just got hacked. Microsoft is putting out software all the time. Everybody's using Microsoft software, but they're constantly having you patch it. And then you have one machine in your environment that's 3 years old that didn't get patched. Well, guess where hackers are going to go? They're going to go to the easiest one that has the easiest exploits, and they get right in. So it will be a constant cat and mouse game. Yes, we may be able to use blockchain to authenticate ourselves, but it'll work for a little while until someone figures out how to get past it and be able to sign things as Zach that are not Zach, or sign things as Andrew that are not Andrew. So
Mhm. Yeah, and quantum computing too is something that I'm also, trying to keep abreast of. One of the big disadvantages that I've seen with these large language models, they aren't cheap to both train as well as operate. OpenAI's Azure bill, I've heard runs in like the millions every single day. And I've even heard some
mhm.
tips where people say if you're trying to generate content during heavy peak hours, they're not sure. Like they haven't talked to anyone at OpenAI about this, but they think that they're actually throttling those iterations of the pipeline to not use as many CPU hours. So the
Mhm.
content that they're getting during the middle of the day is actually, maybe this is just, I don't know, just us hallucinating as humans, trying to find a pattern where there is none. But they see content generated off hours, on weekends, at 2, 3 a.m. as actually like better
Mhm.
quality than what they're getting at noon on a Wednesday. So it's really interesting, kind of the way that people are trying to get around some of these limitations.
That's the first that I've heard of, that throttling. That's an interesting thing, Zach. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah.
You
So
know,
it's
you
just a
mentioned
theory,
quantum.
just something I heard.
Yeah, no, it could be real. You mentioned quantum computing. You know, one of the cybersecurity concerns around quantum computing, of course, is quantum ready encryption, right?
Hmm.
So, any encryption that we have today can be easily broken by quantum computers. But one of the interesting things from the attacker perspective is there are plenty of attackers who have stolen encrypted data today, or recently, and they realize that at some point in the future they will be able to decrypt that data using quantum computers. So like, we're sitting on this treasure trove of encrypted data, and you hear about these breaches every single day. Well, somebody at some point is going to get quantum computing to be able to break all that encryption, and you'll have all kinds of data that's being breached or released or used in attacks in the future. So that, if you're thinking today, oh, I've got my data encrypted, think again, because your data is encrypted with, pre-quantum technology, and once someone has that technology, the ability to break it is going to be much easier.
Hmm. And thank you for keeping me on track too. That was one of the points I was going to bring up. The other one, as it relates to these models, because they are so expensive to run on our silicon binary, ones and zeros. There are some thoughts that once quantum computing does go mainstream, it is possible that these models actually are able to grow exponentially because they're no longer bound to just ones and zeros, the bits, they're only bound to qubits. So they can have a much higher
Mhm.
degree of parallelism. So their cost to train and their cost to operate might actually go down significantly, which it's, what is that, Moore's law, I think, in terms of, like how quickly things
Yep.
grow is at an exponential pace. That's probably the next big iteration that I see. So it's with that boon, we also get, the risks like you were talking about of being able to decrypt things, not having to worry about things being NP complete. To all my nerds out there that know what NP complete means, going back to what I learned back in computer science class in university. There are some really
Yeah,
interesting.
well, I'll give you another nerd quote that supports
Okay.
what you just said. It's a great quote from our favorite movie, Spider-Man, right? And where he says, "With great power comes great responsibility." So you think of all the computing power that's in this little device that you carry around in your pocket all the time, which is exponentially more than building size PCs or your personal computer that you had in the 90s or 2000s or whatever. But imagine how much power you will have with that much computing. And then what are you going to do it? How are you going to use it in an ethical way? How are you going to protect things that need to be protected? It's a great question for the future.
Mhm. Absolutely. There's some really interesting companies that I've actually come across, really interesting projects during my, sort of little foray, my journey into generative AI. You mentioned, LLMs that are essentially disconnected from the internet, especially in the
Yeah.
defense space. For them, that's super
Yep.
important. You can't have the ability for some of these devices that are on an F-16 to require internet connectivity. Because guess what? You're how many thousands of feet up in the air? Like you might get some signal. You might get a bar or two. Defense unicorns, they actually have. They're one of the big defense contractors. They're I believe, a small service disabled veteran owned business too. They have a lot of really cool products out there, but they're starting to get more into, how do you have air gapped like Kubernetes deployments? How do you have air gapped large language model deployments? Because it's a different animal. DARPA is
Yep.
actually incentivizing people on this too, because there was a study done that I read a few months back where someone used GitHub Copilot to be able to generate code from a bunch of different languages, a bunch of different use cases. And what they found was that somewhere between 20 to 30% of the 500 samples that they got had obvious security vulnerabilities in it, which kind of makes sense. GitHub Copilot was trained on code that's on GitHub. Some of that is going to have security
Mhm.
vulnerabilities in it. But if a developer just simply copies and pastes from GitHub Copilot, they're essentially exposing their company to, some nasty stuff. So DARPA actually has a project where they will pay people to train a large language model that looks at
Mhm.
the code generated from generative AI and identifies security vulnerabilities, gives it recommendations. So it's like they're using generative AI to solve some of the shortcomings of generative AI. So I'm curious if there's any other projects that you're kind of keeping a pulse of, anything else that you're seeing in terms of what excites you about the potential to be able to use this technology for good.
Yeah, so one of the cutting edge things in cybersecurity is the ability to look at SBOMs or software bill of materials. And using human beings or the current technology that we have to be able to do that is next to impossible. Using LLM or quantum computers to be able to do that is going to be a lot easier. So the ideal scenario is that as a CISO of a business, you would be able to understand the SBOM of every piece of software that's in your environment. So when someone releases some major flaw like a log4j kind of thing, you can immediately go and say, here's every software that I have that's using that library, and I can fix it or patch it or update it. But today, there's no good tool that's able to give you SBOMs for everything. You can get it for some of your major stuff, but if you think about your computer and how many different services and software is running on it, or a server or a Linux box or a web server or whatever, there's tons of stuff out there. There's stuff that people have made themselves, or they call homegrown apps within companies that use all these snippets of code, and there's all sorts of times when those things are vulnerable. So I don't think anybody has that under control today. I think that's something for the future as well. We've talked a lot about future facing things today, but I think getting SBOM under control using LLMs, I think is a great cybersecurity tool for the future.
Yeah, I agree. I've been researching SBOMs as well, and I found that interesting too. CISA even has different categories of it because you have code level
Mm-hmm.
SBOMs, which is what I as a software developer always think of. But you have build execution environment SBOMs, which would be where Team City came in, which is where Solar went. Like that's that's how they got
Yep.
hit
Yep.
by it, is from their build system. Someone got in and was
Mm-hmm.
able to inject code that was addition to the source code. So an SBOM never would have caught that if you were just looking at your source code. Hardware level, software
Exactly.
level, even all the way up to what tools you use around the software development process, like Jira and Confluence, if you're in the Atlassian stack.
Mm-hmm.
I've gone through, all the list, all the things that I've wanted to talk to you about. I'm curious if you have any closing thoughts, any words of wisdom, that you want to, just kind of conclude, your portion of this conversation with.
Yeah, so I'm just going to start or kind of reiterate what I said at the beginning. I think that generative AI and LLMs are both a beauty and a beast. There are great things about them and great tools that we can use to make things easier, to make things faster, and help us to focus on uh, higher value activities. At the same time, there is a lot of risk associated with it. And we talked about that today with data privacy, with phishing emails, with cyber attacks, quantum decryption, things like that. So I think what we need to do is be conscious of both the good and the bad side of it and approach it that way and see how we can use it in an ethical and a responsible way, in a safe way, and take advantage and harness it as a good tool that it is. So I hope that people will find better ways to do that moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people are curious to learn more about you, learn more about your work, what social media are you on? Are you on, Instagram? Do we get to see, pictures of like any woodworking activities? Like where can people find you, to learn more about you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. I think I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. You can just look up my name. I also have a website. My wife convinced me last year I needed to create kind of a portfolio of all the stuff I did, like this. This will show up on my website, Zach. So my website is cybersecurityintheboardroom.com. So you can check me out there or check me out on LinkedIn. That's where you can find me.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for your time. This has been real. I've learned a lot of things. Thanks everyone for tuning in for the full thing, and we'll see you in the future.